In this video, we explore the cases of juveniles who were sentenced to death row. We will look at details about their crimes, the judicial process they faced, their last meals, and their final words before execution. 15. Leonard Shockley. On April 8, 1958, 16-year-old Leonard Shockley and his older brother Harold Shockley broke into the home of an elderly white woman, Sarah Hearn, in Worcester County, Maryland. The break-in quickly turned violent when Leonard shot and killed Hearn with a .22 caliber rifle. The crime shocked the community, especially given Leonard's young age. Leonard was arrested along with his older brother, but Harold was sentenced to life in prison, while Leonard, despite being younger, was given the death penalty. The decision was controversial, as his defense argued that Leonard had been influenced by his older sibling. Nonetheless, the jury convicted him swiftly, and Maryland's governor refused to grant clemency. On April 10, 1959, Leonard Shockley was executed in the Maryland gas chamber. As the youngest person ever executed in the state, his case drew widespread attention, but no last-minute appeals or interventions were granted. Witnesses described him as visibly nervous but resigned to his fate. There is no official record of Shockley requesting a special last meal, meaning he likely ate the standard prison fare before his execution. His last words were not formally documented, but reports suggest he expressed fear and regret in his final moments, with some witnesses recalling that he murmured a quiet apology before being led to the gas chamber. 14. James Arsene. James Arsene was only 10 years old when he participated in a robbery and murder in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, in 1872. Alongside a fellow outlaw, he was involved in the killing of a travelling salesman during a botched robbery attempt. Despite his young age, Arsene was implicated in the crime and went into hiding for several years. Arsene was eventually arrested and tried at the age of 23. Despite being a minor at the time of the crime, he was sentenced to death under federal law. His trial was controversial due to his youth at the time of the offence, and the long delay between the crime and his arrest. Nevertheless, the court upheld the death sentence, and no appeals for clemency were granted. On June 18, 1885, James Arsene was executed by hanging. His execution marked one of the youngest offenders to be sentenced to death for a crime committed as a child. Witnesses described him as calm but resigned to his fate, accepting the punishment despite the years that had passed. Details about Arsene's last meal were not recorded, as documentation from that era was often sparse. His last words, according to reports, were a brief statement expressing remorse. "I am sorry for what I did, and I pray for forgiveness." 13. Sean Sellers. In 1986, 16-year-old Sean Sellers murdered 3 people in Oklahoma in separate incidents. His first victim was a convenience store clerk, Paul Bellafato, whom Sellers shot in the head during a robbery. A few months later, in a shocking turn of events, he murdered his own mother, Vonda Bell Sellers, and his stepfather Paul Sellers while they slept. Sellers later claimed he was heavily involved in Satanism at the time and committed the murders under the influence of demonic forces. Sellers was tried as an adult, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1986. His defense team attempted to argue that he suffered from dissociative identity disorder and that his crimes were committed during a state of mental illness. However, the jury dismissed these claims, and he was found guilty. His case gained international attention, as he was one of the few individuals sentenced to death for crimes committed at such a young age. Despite multiple appeals and protests from human rights organisations, his execution was carried out. On February 4, 1999, at the age of 29, Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. In the years leading up to his execution, he had converted to Christianity and expressed deep remorse for his actions. Religious groups and anti-death penalty activists campaigned for clemency, arguing that he had reformed. But Oklahoma authorities refused to intervene. Sellers did not request a special last meal and ate the standard prison meal offered that day. His final words were directed at the families of his victims and his supporters. "Tonight I lay down my life for the sake of Jesus. If my death brings you peace, then I am glad. I have prayed for all of you." 12. Napoleon Beasley. On April 19, 1994, 17-year-old Napoleon Beasley murdered 63-year-old John Luttig, a prominent businessman and the father of a federal judge, during a carjacking in Tyler, Texas. Beasley and 2 accomplices targeted Luttig's Mercedes-Benz. During the robbery, Beasley shot Luttig in the head at close range while his wife watched in horror. The crime was widely condemned due to its brutality and the victim's high-profile connections. Beasley was arrested and charged with capital murder. Despite being 17 at the time of the crime, he was tried as an adult. His two accomplices, both minors, received life sentences, but Beasley, who pulled the trigger, was sentenced to death in 1995. His trial was highly controversial due to racial bias. Beasley was black while the victim was white. Inadequate legal representation, and the fact that Texas frequently sentenced juveniles to death at the time. On May 28, 2002, at the age of 25, Napoleon Beasley was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His execution drew protests from human rights groups, religious leaders, and even Supreme Court justices, who questioned the fairness of executing someone for a crime committed at 17. However, Texas authorities did not intervene. Witnesses said Beasley remained calm as he walked into the execution chamber. Beasley declined to request a special last meal, opting instead to fast on the day of his execution. His final words were reflective and remorseful. "The act I committed to put me here was not just heinous, it was senseless. But the person that committed that act is no longer here. I am." 11. Willie Francis. In 1944, 16-year-old Willie Francis was convicted of the murder of Andrew Thomas, a white pharmacist in St. Martinville, Louisiana. Thomas was found shot to death in his home, and Francis was arrested after being caught with Thomas's wallet and identification. Francis initially denied involvement, but later confessed under police interrogation. His confession was questionable, as reports suggested he was coerced, and no concrete evidence directly linked him to the crime. Francis was quickly tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1945. His trial lasted just one day, and his court-appointed defense attorney made little effort to challenge the evidence or the validity of his confession. The case later became infamous not just for the questionable conviction, but for the botched execution attempt that followed. On May 3, 1946, at the age of 17, Francis was placed in Louisiana's electric chair. However, due to an error by the executioners, who were intoxicated at the time, the electric chair malfunctioned, and Francis survived. Witnesses reported that he screamed, "Take it off, let me breathe," before the electricity failed. This led to a legal challenge, with Francis's lawyers arguing that a second execution would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. The case, Francis v. Resweber 1947, reached the US Supreme Court, which ruled 5-4 that a second execution attempt was constitutional. After losing his Supreme Court appeal, Willie Francis was executed successfully on May 9, 1947, at the age of 18. This time there were no technical malfunctions, and the electric chair functioned as intended. Witnesses described Francis as composed but fearful as he was led to the chamber. Francis's last meal was not officially documented, but it is believed that he ate the standard prison fare. His final words, spoken moments before the switch was flipped, were, "I am ready to go." 10. Steve Roach. On December 3, 1993, 17-year-old Steve Roach shot and killed his 70-year-old neighbour, Mary Ann Hughes, during a botched robbery in Greene County, Virginia. Roach, who was reportedly struggling with financial issues and had no prior violent history, later admitted that he did not intend to kill Hughes but panicked and pulled the trigger when she resisted. Roach was quickly arrested and confessed to the crime. Despite his young age and expressions of remorse, he was tried as an adult, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death in 1995. His lawyers argued that his age and lack of previous offences should warrant leniency, but appeals courts upheld his sentence. His case gained international attention, with human rights groups protesting the execution of a minor. On January 13, 2000, at the age of 23, Steve Roach was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. In his final days, he expressed regret and took full responsibility for his actions. He spent his last hours in prayer and speaking with family members who were present at the execution. For his last meal, Roach requested fried chicken, pizza, and a Dr. Pepper. His final words were a direct apology to the victim's family. "I would like to apologize to the victim's family and to my family for the pain I have caused everyone. I would like to thank all of the people who supported me over the years. I love you all. I'm ready to go. 9. Gerald Mitchell. In June 1985, 17-year-old Gerald Mitchell committed a brutal murder in Houston, Texas. Under the influence of drugs and alcohol, Mitchell attempted to rob 20-year-old Charles Marino. During the robbery, he shot Marino twice, killing him instantly. Mitchell was later linked to another shooting that same night, which left another victim injured but alive. Mitchell was arrested soon after the murder and quickly confessed to the crime. Despite his age, he was tried as an adult and sentenced to death in 1986. His defense argued that his youth, intoxication, and lack of intent to kill should be considered mitigating factors. However, the jury rejected these arguments, and appeals courts upheld his death sentence. On October 22, 2001, at the age of 33, Gerald Mitchell was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Anti-death penalty activists protested his execution, citing his age at the time of the crime and the fact that Texas was one of the few states still executing juvenile offenders. Mitchell remained calm as he was led into the execution chamber. Mitchell requested a final meal of 3 enchiladas, 1 beef burrito, and 3 fajitas. His last words were brief and remorseful. I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could take it back. I hope my death brings peace to those I have hurt. 8. Scott Allen Hayne. On October 6, 1987, 17-year-old Scott Allen Hayne and his accomplice, Robert Lambert, committed a gruesome double murder in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The two teenagers kidnapped Michael Houghton, 27, and Laura Sanders, 22, locking them inside the trunk of a car before setting it on fire. The victims burned to death inside the vehicle. Prosecutors described the crime as exceptionally cruel, as the victims were still alive when the fire started. Hayne was arrested shortly after the crime and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Although he was a minor at the time of the crime, Oklahoma law allowed him to be tried as an adult. His defense argued that his youth and troubled upbringing should be considered mitigating factors, but the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death in 1988. Appeals courts upheld his sentence, despite efforts from human rights organisations and legal advocates who opposed the execution of juvenile offenders. On April 3, 2003, at the age of 32, Scott Hayne was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. His case drew national and international protests, as he became the last person in the United States to be executed for a crime committed as a juvenile before the US Supreme Court banned the practice in Roper v. Simmons, 2005. Witnesses reported that Hayne remained composed as he entered the execution chamber. For his last meal, Hayne requested fried chicken, French fries, and a Pepsi. His final words were, "I have nothing to say, let's get it over with." 7. Curtis Paul Harris. On January 20, 1978, 17-year-old Curtis Paul Harris was involved in the robbery and brutal murder of 81-year-old James Grayson in Houston, Texas. Harris and an accomplice entered Grayson's home intending to steal money, but ended up savagely beating and stabbing the elderly man to death. The crime shocked the community due to the excessive violence inflicted on the victim. Harris was arrested shortly after the murder and charged with capital murder. Despite being a juvenile at the time of the crime, he was tried as an adult and sentenced to death in 1978. His defense team argued that his troubled upbringing and lack of intent to kill should be considered mitigating factors, but the jury unanimously sentenced him to death. His appeals were denied, and the case did not gain significant public attention compared to other juvenile executions. On July 1, 1993, at the age of 32, Curtis Paul Harris was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Reports indicate that he remained quiet and solemn in his final moments, offering little resistance as he was led into the execution chamber. Harris requested a last meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and a chocolate milkshake. His final words were brief and remorseful. "I'm sorry for what I have done. I hope my death brings peace." 6. Ruben Cantu. In 1984, 17-year-old Ruben Cantu was accused of shooting and killing Pedro Gomez, a San Antonio construction worker, during a home robbery. Cantu and an accomplice allegedly broke into a house where Gomez was staying and shot him multiple times, killing him and severely injuring another man, Juan Moreno, who survived. Moreno later identified Cantu as the shooter a key piece of evidence in the case. Cantu was arrested, tried as an adult, and convicted of capital murder in 1985. His trial was highly controversial, as no physical evidence tied him to the crime, and his conviction was based primarily on the testimony of Juan Moreno. Years later, Moreno recanted his testimony, saying he had been pressured by police to identify Cantu. Despite significant doubts about his guilt, appeals courts denied Cantu's claims of innocence, and his execution proceeded as scheduled. On August 24, 1993, at the age of 26, Ruben Cantu was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Witnesses described him as calm but visibly emotional in his final moments. Cantu requested a cheeseburger, French fries, and a strawberry milkshake as his final meal. His last words were haunting and spoke to the doubts surrounding his case. "I'm innocent. I did not do it. I'm sorry for what is happening. I hold no grudges." 5. Jay Pinkerton. In 1981, 17-year-old Jay Pinkerton committed 2 brutal murders in Texas. The first victim was 31-year-old Pamela Mosley Carpenter, whom he stabbed to death during a home invasion in Amarillo. Shortly afterward, he murdered 28-year-old Mickey Joe Wright in a similar attack. Pinkerton was known for his violent tendencies and had a history of burglaries and attacks before committing these murders. Pinkerton was arrested in 1981 and charged with both murders. Despite his young age, he was tried as an adult and convicted of capital murder. The jury sentenced him to death in 1982, citing the brutality of the crimes and his lack of remorse. Pinkerton's appeals were repeatedly denied, and his execution date was set without significant opposition or intervention from human rights organizations. On May 15, 1986, at the age of 24, Jay Pinkerton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He remained quiet in his final moments, showing little emotion as he was strapped to the gurney. For his last meal, Pinkerton requested steak, French fries, salad with ranch dressing, and a chocolate milkshake. His final words were, "It's all been said, I have nothing to say." 4. Roy Allen Harnois. On February 5, 1975, 17-year-old Roy Allen Harnois was involved in the brutal murder of an elderly woman, Edna Mae Brown, in Brevard County, Florida. Harnois and an accomplice broke into Brown's home intending to rob her, but the situation escalated when Harnois violently assaulted and strangled the 70-year-old woman. She was left to die while the two fled with stolen valuables. Harnois was arrested shortly after the crime and charged with first-degree murder. Due to the violent nature of the attack and the victim's age, he was tried as an adult. Despite efforts by his defense team to emphasize his young age and lack of previous violent offenses, the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death in 1975. His appeals were unsuccessful, and Florida authorities moved forward with his execution. On November 6, 1983, at the age of 26, Roy Allen Harnois was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison. Witnesses reported that he appeared nervous but accepted his fate without resistance. Harnois requested fried shrimp, coleslaw, French fries, and a Coca-Cola as his last meal. His final words were short and resigned. "I take full responsibility. I am sorry." 3. Charles Rumbaugh. In 1975, 17-year-old Charles Rumbaugh committed a robbery in Texas that escalated to murder. During the course of the robbery, Rumbaugh fatally shot a victim, leading to his arrest and subsequent charges. Rumbaugh was arrested and charged with capital murder. Despite his age, he was tried as an adult and, upon conviction, was sentenced to death. His appeals were unsuccessful, and his execution was scheduled. On September 11, 1985, at the age of 28, Charles Rumbaugh was executed by lethal injection in Texas. Reports indicate that he faced his execution with composure. Details regarding Rumbaugh's last meal and final words are not well documented. Available records do not provide specific information about his choices or statements in his final moments. 2. Joseph Cannon. In 1977, 17-year-old Joseph Cannon fatally shot Ann Walsh during a robbery in San Antonio, Texas. Cannon had a troubled childhood, marked by abuse and neglect, which his defense argued contributed to his criminal behavior. Cannon was arrested and charged with capital murder. Despite his age and traumatic background, he was tried as an adult and sentenced to death in 1980. His case underwent numerous appeals, focusing on his mental health and the appropriateness of the death penalty for a juvenile offender. However, the courts upheld his sentence, and his execution was scheduled. On April 22, 1998, at the age of 38, Joseph Cannon was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Witnesses reported that he appeared calm and expressed remorse for his actions in his final statement. Cannon requested a cheeseburger, French fries, and a Coke for his last meal. His final words were, "I am sorry for the pain I have caused. I hope my death brings peace to those I have hurt." 1. George Stinney Jr. In March 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was accused of murdering two white girls, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, in Alcaloo, South Carolina. The girls had been riding their bicycles near the segregated black neighborhood when they disappeared. Their bodies were found in a ditch the next day, brutally beaten with a railroad spike. Stinney, who had been seen speaking to the girls earlier, was arrested and interrogated without his parents or a lawyer present. Stinney's trial was shockingly swift. His court-appointed lawyer, who had never tried a capital case before, did little to defend him. The trial lasted just 2 hours, with an all-white jury deliberating for only 10 minutes before sentencing him to death. No physical evidence linked Stinney to the crime, and his alleged confession was questionable, given that he was a scared 14-year-old facing relentless police pressure. Despite appeals from civil rights groups, South Carolina's governor refused clemency, sealing Stinney's fate. On June 16, 1944, just 83 days after his arrest, George Stinney Jr. was led to the execution chamber at the South Carolina Penitentiary. At barely 5 feet tall and 90 pounds, he was too small for the electric chair. Officials had to use a Bible as a booster seat to ensure the electrodes made proper contact. Witnesses reported that the oversized mask slipped off during the execution, exposing the terrified boy's face as the electricity surged through his body. There is no official record of a last meal for Stinney, and at just 14 years old, he likely wasn't given the same rights as adult death row inmates. His final words remain unknown, as he was only a child with no legal support or family present in his final moments. In 2014, after decades of scrutiny and legal battles, George Stinney Jr.'s conviction was vacated. A judge ruled that his trial had been a miscarriage of justice, acknowledging the lack of evidence and the improper legal procedures used against him. His case remains one of the most tragic examples of how the legal system once failed to protect minors, and it stands as a reminder of the racial and judicial injustices that plagued the past.